Okay, apologies for the harsh cutoff right there, because I thought my camera battery was going to last a lot longer than it did, and I get long-winded and I should have known better. So it's a good thing I charged both of them. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I have no idea how long this one is going to last, and I don't want to fiddle with trying to figure out if I can change a setting that'll make it last longer. Anyways, all I was saying before I got so rudely interrupted by my own stupidity is that what you're really drawing are, and again, in realistic drawing, you're drawing changes in light. Turn my viewfinder so I can see what I'm doing here. And the way it bends around objects. So it's different in contour line drawing when you really are working with the lines and shapes of an object and whatnot, but once you get into gradients and halftones, which is what this is called, or shading of any kind, once you're actually adding shading, then you're working with light and not necessarily just the lines themselves. Okay, better lay some of this down here. It is 9:30 already. That's alright. I'll probably hyperfocus like I usually do and not even notice that suddenly it's 2 in the morning. So I can pay a little bit better attention to this. I may not say as much for a while, or I'll get chatty. We'll find out. But whenever if I'm changing tools or doing something specific, I'll explain that stuff as I go along. And now you can just kind of watch me go for a while. Make sure you can see what I'm doing. Okay. It's amazing how dark that looks up there. So we'll find out how well this came out when I get into editing. And like with the first thing I filmed, I did it on my phone, and I didn't know that it cut off every 10 minutes. So I had like 7 parts, and I'd be talking and I'd hear the click, and I'm like, okay, what did I just say? I'm sure, dang it, I just said something cool and I get cut off. Okay, what was I talking about? Anyway, so once I actually pull this footage off and edit it, we'll find out if it even looks decent. And that matters only because I'll be kind of disappointed if, alright, well no big deal, I'll do it again, but dang it, now I gotta make sure I remember to say all this stuff. Well, I guess I would, because when I'm holding these tools, it'll jog my memory. I'm telling you, ADD is a lot of work sometimes, guys. I don't have the H though. ADD, not ADHD. I couldn't be hyper if I couldn't be hyper if you zap me with a cattle prod. Believe me. I am constantly, my default setting is chill, and I permanently am on Mosey setting. I think I'm going to go kind of dark down there. There's a whole bunch of weird smearings and patterns up here and whatnot that I'm going to correct as I go, because some of those areas are going to get darker and they'll get covered up. But I don't like how they're coming out so far. But as I said earlier, it's just time spent. That's true for this too. This is a relatively easy thing to do, even though I am doing it deliberately in some areas. And the more deliberate look to it is going to be after I've laid on pretty much what I want, and I go back and start lifting some of that out to create some of the lighter areas. That's what I tend to do for a lot of my highlights. It depends on what it is. If it's a very light subject or drawing that I'm working on, then I'm pretty much, the white of the paper can be the absolute highlight, and it is in this case in a couple areas. But I just build up to that. But whenever I'm going over dark areas, it's difficult to try to draw around things. That's really not a very efficient way to do it, like with this movement in his hair right here and whatnot. What I like to do instead, and it's kind of akin to the way that I paint also, or a lot of people do, because with pigment you can just layer and layer and layer things and they, on top of each other, they constantly show. When you're working with transparent things like watercolor or graphite or charcoal or anything that very, very thin and delicate and misty and light, it's harder to do that because stuff will show through it. So what I will do in some cases, when I've got sharp highlights, like in his hair here, that's on top of a darker area, when I was laying this in, and I'll explain more of this in a hair tutorial I'll do later, I won't get into it now, but for all this part here, all this dark stuff I actually did lay down in pencil and blend it out with a blending stump, but where I knew those highlights were going to be, those areas were very faintly covered or not at all, because I think I mentioned earlier, you just don't want to have to take up a lot of graphite again later if you can help it, if you can avoid it at all. It's just a pain. It's not impossible, sometimes it really is. It depends on how heavy-handed you were and how much you ground it into the tooth and how much graphite is still there, or charcoal or pastel or whatever it is. But it's just, it makes it harder on you and it's more work, and sometimes it can be irreversible because you just cannot get it back up. So anything that you know is going to be a highlight later, don't put as much material there at all, or don't put it there at all if you know it's going to be super light or an absolute paper white highlight later. But what I like to do in those cases, and I leave those areas lighter, but because I know there's going to be midtones and darker areas and shadows that are going to show behind them, which is how you get the actual movement of hair, I'm not literally drawing those in. Sometimes I do to get with a finer detail, I'm putting some actual stroke back in to define it a little bit better. But what I do in those cases is that once I've got the darks put in, and I'll be going back and putting darks back in too to intensify them, because you're constantly checking your values as you go along. That's how light something is and how dark something is. That when I get to putting highlights in, I will use like a pencil eraser, depending on how big the subject I'm working on, if the tip is too big, or especially pencil erasers and this Tombow Mono, this very, very, very fine eraser tip. Genius, I love these. What I actually go do is I do draw the highlights in a way, but I'm drawing them with an eraser. I'm actually taking that stuff back off the paper and literally drawing it in that way. So then you still get the right effect, but you get the highlights there, but you're not drawing literally every friggin' stroke, and you've still got the right amount of show through from the layers underneath and whatnot, and it's just a much better and more efficient way to do it. So you get more realistic looking hair without it taking damn ever. And I don't like stuff that takes a long time. If I can find a shortcut and get the same effect, I will do it that way every time. And you discover stuff on every drawing that way that you just like, oh hey, that turned out cool, or you just discover another way to do it, or you saw somebody else do it and you modified it in a way, whatever. Every drawing, you learn something new. Every single one. And anybody who says you don't is either a liar or doing it wrong. And though I may not get to the wings on this filming, I actually am going to do them tonight as much as I can get through before I really just do actually have to go to bed finally. I'm terrible about not getting enough sleep, so I'm trying to police myself on that. And because I'm not liking that, I'm going to try switch, whoops, just shot powder all over myself. And my chamois, dang it. I'm going to try switching to my fan for a second. A lot of things are trial and error to me too. There are certain things that I just do because I've done it before and I know, either I know how that tool is going to work or I've done it before and I've developed a technique I like. And some things I'm just like, alright, well let's see what this does. No. So I don't like there's a weird curve pattern that's making. I don't like that at all. Okay. when you want something to stay patternless, that's why I use filberts, because they don't have harsh edges. And this basically is what amounts to a filbert. I mean, it looks like a makeup brush. And there are some makeup brushes, actually, because, you know, art supplies can be expensive. You don't want to use just any makeup brush, because a lot of them can be cheaper and the bristles aren't quite what you want, and they don't interact with the media very well or on the paper or whatever. But there are some that are a little more expensive, and if they're like the super fancy makeup brushes that cost as much of a paintbrush anyway, then just buy the proper art material. But there can be nice, decently nice quality makeup brushes out there that work as brushes for art supplies too, especially the soft ones. Oh, even eyelash or eyebrow combs can be used for various things too, depends what you want them for. But sometimes that's a cheap way to get some more tools without paying those ridiculous starving artist prices. Like I said, I'm notoriously cheap in some things. Some things I will pay out the nose for, and some things I just absolutely will not. Okay, hopefully you can... Okay, what is that? Oh, sometimes I can't tell on the viewfinder on my camera if there's something actually in the scene or if it's just something I'm seeing overlaid on the viewfinder screen. I'm actually pretty blind too. I don't see it. It's just far enough away that I can't really see in fine detail what's going on back there. So every now and then I'll be looking back at the thing to say, okay, am I in the way? Can they even see this? I think the last time I laid in a depth background like this, it was only, I want to say it was 11 by 14 Bristol. For some reason I was thinking it was 14 by 17, but it couldn't be. I think it was 11 by 14. Ugh! God, that was harsh. And it was a lot lighter, but it was a much smaller area. So this is a little bit more work than it's taken me in the past. Partially because of the size and partially because I'm doing it a lot darker. Those were... There wasn't this dark at all. I think maybe the darkest area I put on those was like around this area, and it went faded off to just kind of light looking. So I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. Which is what I said half an hour ago, didn't I? Make sure my head's not in the way. My head in the way, yeah, it probably was. And because I'm doing a random loose pattern, is the only reason I'm doing this left-handed. I would ordinarily never use my left hand for anything, certainly not this kind of detailed work. My left hand is basically just for show. It's useless. I'm so overwhelmingly right-handed that even though it's not causing me a problem to get this done because of what I'm doing, it still feels just wrong and I hate it. But I kind of have to, so you guys can see what I'm doing and my head stays out of the way. Oops. And anytime I get too distinct and streaky of a pattern, I'll just take that back off as I go. I'm going to, again, try to correct things as you go along, depending on what you're trying to achieve and the effect you want, and your particular technique, because you all will develop your own. Every artist does. No there are certain things we all kind of do the same way, you know, like the same tools we use or whatever, or just certain things that you do similarly, if not identical, but for the most part, we all do it our own way. In our own sweet time. But just because I've been doing it for, how old am I again? See, I started when I was 3 and was drawing more like this by the time I was 5, so 40 years. I have learned in 40 years that there are certain things that you just don't want to do if you can help it. Correct as you go in some ways. It's going to save you hassle later. And after I get this laid on, I may decide, once I start getting into the detail of the effect I want in the back, I may decide that I've got some of this, like, yeah, that's way too much there, I don't want that at all, I'll just take it back off. That's why I'm using a brush in light layers of it. Because if I'd done this with pencil stroke, it would have taken so much longer and would have been so much more of a pain to try to work with and correct and take back up later. And it wouldn't have been as smooth as I wanted. I could have gotten it like that eventually, but that's partially what it would have taken so dang long. Is that blending out perfect gradients using the tip of a pencil, that's just unnecessary a lot of the time for this kind of effect. I mean, that's busy work for no decent purpose. I mean, why do it that way? You don't have to. A lot of this is going to be kind of backlit, so I'm not going to put a whole lot up here. But because I don't want too much of a halo effect, because I don't know what I'm going to take back off later, I'm going to put just a little bit in there, because I don't want a really harsh blended line out that I can't really match very well later. I mean, with this stuff I can, and I know what I'm doing, so I know I can, but again, I'm just saving myself some possible hassle later, because you just don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do in certain areas yet until I plan that when I get to it, pretty much. And with a lot of this stuff, I literally jump off that bridge when I come to it. So there's things I do just to save myself the hassle later, potentially. If it ends up not mattering, fine. But if it turns out it really would have been important that, oh, I wish that wasn't there, well, all right, I won't put it. You can always put stuff on. It's much harder to take it back off later. Same with makeup artists. And the way you hold a tool can make all the difference sometimes as to why you get weird streaks with something in particular. It's the angle you're holding it at, it's the motion you're using, are you using it this way, are you using it this way, are you pounding at it, or, well, yeah, pounding at it can leave like real distinct stuff as opposed to flowing off the page when you want something to look smoother. And I got a little ham-fisted with that. And pretty sure I'm going to have some highlight down there. So actually I'm going to take up quite a bit of that, because I think I'm going to cut a new piece of this because it's kind of getting sticky, which is partially the problem I'm having with that. It's not laying back over it the way I want, because that's starting to put some residue on it. I think some of that is my fault, because sometimes I'm not very good about making sure my hands are clean when I'm stretching my blue tack. Like they were when I started, but for some reason I've got crud all over my hands now, and I'm like, whatever, I don't want to get up. Lazy. Matter of fact, there's some areas I want to correct now, so I am going to do that. I don't want to get up and wash my hands off. Mr. Paper Towel. Really, I don't care that I've got graphite all over my hands. I mean, when don't I? It's perpetually graphite or watercolor or pastel or something under my fingernails at any given time. That's not really going to matter much because it doesn't offset from your fingers that much. Charcoal will more often, and it depends on how much you have on there, but really it's the oils you really want to not be there. Don't have lotion or makeup or anything like that on your fingers. If you're working in graphite or charcoal, you're just asking for it if you do that. Actually, this is not the exact oil I use for that. Ah! Oh, one thing I really did not want to have happen is don't move the camera! It took me way too long to get that right. Crap, and I may not be able to get this drawer open now. Ah! Come on. Come out. Okay. See, I won. Okay, ordinarily I would not do this holding it up in the air too, because I'm a klutz and I could, but that's about all I'm going to take. I'm going to do the rest of it down here. Because I know I will just stab myself in the finger if I had to try to cut all the way through that like that. Actually, what is wrong with me? I'm spacing off today. I don't use that either. I just use good old utility scissors. What the hell am I talking about? I don't cut that off with X-Acto either. Alright, T-tack can go over there. And I don't really ever just use the strip right out of the package. I always stretch it out a little bit too, just to kind of activate it, because it's not exactly sticky, but there's a little bit of a gloss to it. And okay, whatever finish or residue is on that thing, I don't want to take the risk of that touching my paper, whatever that is. So for blue tack, or I have some other stuff too that's like this weird, that weird putty that you can use to put posters up on walls with, anything like that, gum erasers, you do want to stretch it out to kind of activate it first, for lack of a better word. Oops. Okay. That left a pattern I don't like, so after I lifted some off, now I'm going to smooth that back out if I can. Yay! Came out the way I wanted. You gotta go. I think I might have actually touched the paper there at the time I was working on it, like just moving the board or something. No, I don't think so. That's unlike me. I'm really huffy about that. I'm gonna fix this one. Ah, there we go. That looks much better. Put some of the pattern over there. Make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. I don't know how long I was talking before, so I'm not exactly sure how long this battery lasts. So I don't really have any kind of indicator that I can see on my viewfinder. So I think I've gone over a lot of the basics of graphite powder, so apologies if we get cut off. I think it's still going to be a while yet, but I'll film more again, and this is not really when I do what I would consider a proper tutorial in graphite powder that goes through a lot of the basics and various different types of techniques and effects with brushes and stuff like that. That one will have more of that in it. This is just kind of an excuse to show some of that stuff because it's something I'm working on already anyway. But hopefully you've seen enough to get the general idea. And as I yammered at you endlessly earlier, you can ask me questions anytime. Okay, now then, I'm going to start putting in some very deliberate areas here. I'm not really going to explain much about why I'm doing it and where, because I don't want to get into that right now. That's just too big of a topic. That's more of a technique tutorial that I would show you later, and I'm trying to actually get this thing done. Because every minute I spend on this, I have another commissioned portrait to do, which is really, again, another gift for a friend of mine who's been waiting very patiently for over a year. But every minute I spend on these is me not getting back to commissions, and which means I'm not making money, and day jobs don't get rid of themselves. So I'm trying to get this stuff taken care of as quickly as possible. And I doubt she'll have any reason to, but Ma, if you end up watching this tutorial for any reason, though you've heard me say it countless times in the last couple of months, this is your last one for a while. I've done 3 pieces for her already, and 2 of them were just as elaborate as this one, although smaller size, so I spent a lot of time on those. One of them was 50 hours, the other one was about 75. The last, that big pastel I mentioned earlier that I did for charity work, that one took me 107. And that's not all necessarily in one sitting. Well, I mean, not like day after day after day after day. There are times where sometimes I just, okay, you know what, I'm bored with the section I'm working on and I don't feel like doing it right now, or I got something else I got to do. And some days I do just draw every day. Go, 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 go. So, but because that pastel was a very, very elaborate subject and a lot of blending and delicate stuff that had to be done, it was just going to take longer anyway. A lot of different layers to build up and things to do. That it took me longer than it should, because there were like weeks at a time where I wouldn't, or whole weeks where I wouldn't work on it, and I'd do a couple hours one night. But anyway, trying not to waste as much time and take as long on these as I have in the past. Because I'm too nice, and I did a bunch of stuff for charity last year, I ended up selling 1 piece all year. The rest of it was charity work and gifts. We're not doing that this year, y'all. I will mention that the reason I'm doing this like this on purpose is sometimes I just want the bristles to skiff off the paper like that, but also because I'm trying to avoid obvious pattern like these weird blotches that will get taken care of. Some of this stuff I know it's going to get covered up, so I don't care. In some cases, I'm like, alright, I'll come back to that in a minute. Take that back up. But I do tend to work more, even though I tell people work light to dark, that's true a lot of the time. With some of my personal drawing style, it's just, I can't really explain to you why I do it this way or why I like to or whatever, but I kind of like to, sometimes it really is dark to light for me because I like to put stuff down in a big area and then take things back up to create the detail of the dimension I want because it's faster. So, because I know I want to be able to put a bunch of, I want to load stuff up here, but I don't want to have to, some weird little streaks in here. Like, okay, I just want to be able to get through getting down some of my darks and some of the heavier coverage now, and I'll come back and fix that stuff later. If I'm about to go over it for whatever reason, I'll fix that before I mess with it, sure, but okay, I'm not going to be in that area right now, I'll come back to it. And ooh, I definitely am going to have to get a slightly different tripod or arm set up for my camera, because it is making my shoulders hurt to hold my arm up here for this long. So I have to keep, I'm switching sides for that reason, so I can keep switching arms and give one a rest temporarily. But I am starting to put some deliberate cloud effect pattern in here, so occasionally I'm scumbling all over the place and occasionally I'm actually pushing. Wait, there's shadow. Okay, in some cases I'm actually pushing graphite powder into the tooth on purpose because I know it's making a certain kind of ridge that I want, like kind of cloud shapes. Again, that's more something I would, if I was going to be showing the actual technique. I'm not going to be doing that today, so I'm not going to get real into why I'm doing it when. So as I've said a couple of times now, I'm just going to kind of keep going here. And either I find a natural stopping point and I turn the camera off, or the thing just goes dead on me, like it did last time. If that's the case, hope you're getting something out of this, or at least enjoyed watching. And if we get cut off, I will see you later. If we don't, then I will give you a fond farewell later. Purposeful fond farewell later. I haven't decided how much to start getting into this. I do want some depth behind his head, so I think I am gonna, there'll be some areas that are deliberately light, but I am gonna actually kind of load up some color back here like I did down here, because there's hard highlight over here, and you wouldn't really be able to tell that was there if there wasn't a deeper dimension back here to offset it. Like I said, you're really drawing or rendering or painting light. You're not painting objects. That's probably the other big thing. One more thing I'll mention. Probably the other big thing in realism. You have to pay attention to your light source. If that's not consistent, it will look it, and it will look out of kilter and odd because your light changes don't look natural. Because whether you're aware of it or not, your eye sees it. So even if you don't understand why something doesn't look right to you, your eye sure knows. And you will see it regardless of whether or not you understand why. So one of the things I always tell my students is that when something doesn't look 3D enough, I guess, for lack of a better word, or realistic enough, it's because your lights aren't light enough and your darks aren't dark enough. So, and that's called value, how on a spectrum, how light something is from absolute white to absolute black is a value of scale. So if everything is too much the same value of grayness and midtone, it's going to look very flat. If everything's too dark, it's going to look flat and weird. If everything's too light, it's going to look washed out and it's not going to look real. So you have to pay attention to, okay, paying attention to what color something is going to be and what value it changes to and that too. That's a whole other thing. I'm not going to get into that either. But you've got what amounts to your midtones. All right, well, if your darkest highlight should still be way lighter than your lightest midtone. Your darkest midtone should still be lighter than your darkest shadow. If that makes sense. So if those two things are too close together, it won't look right. So okay, this is supposed to be a highlight, for example, not what I'm doing right now. This is supposed to be a highlight. However, the stuff I have next to it is too light to be the midtone that's supposed to be next to it. So that midtone needs to be darker, so that highlight offsets and shows better. And at the other end of the spectrum also, okay, this, like right here or something, that because of the way light's hitting it, this should be, making sure you can see me again, this should be darker on this edge because of the way my light source is coming, which is like from right here. So this has to be darker than this part, and all of this lighter stuff here is the actual highlight, because everything that is closest to the light source is the lightest, and everything farthest away from it is going to be the darkest, and that's how you build dimension also. So if this wasn't darker, it wouldn't look three-dimensional, because if it was all too much the same tone, it would look flat. Because, okay, well, the light is farthest away when things are very close together and light isn't passing through them, but also because this is very deep and there's no room for light to get into it. It's not technically farthest away from the camera or the light source, but it kind of is. It's hard to explain. Never mind. But so this should be way darker than anything right here because it's closer to the light source. And then in scale from there. I think you get the general idea. So one thing that will automatically make somebody's work look better, even if they're relatively skilled in sketch drawing, but they're having a problem with rendering realism, probably the very first thing that I would ever tell them, after looking at it, sometimes it may not matter, and one of the #1 things you can do that is automatically going to make it look better, make sure your lights are light enough and your darks are dark enough and that they're distinct from each other. There are very, very, very subtle changes, of course, but when you're jumping to a relative, a light is hitting something way more than another part of it and it's obvious to your eye, I mean, obvious that you know it's there too, that has to be right. And when I said earlier about making sure that you're always paying attention to your light source, you could have light coming from here and here, or it could just be from here or from up here, whatever. It doesn't matter. Whether if you're going off a reference order, there's obviously a light source in it somewhere. If you're setting up your own objects, whatever it is, your own still life, it doesn't matter. If it's something that you're making up off the top of your head and you're not looking at anything and you're just drawing something in your own mind, but you still want it to be a recognizable object with some kind of realism, you still have to pick a light source and it has to be consistent. So wherever that light source is coming from, everything has to follow that contour. My light is coming right from here, but there's a little bit of a backlight and a secondary light source, which is why there's a hard highlight over here, but most of the lightness of his fade is right here because that's where most of it is coming from, which is why this part of the jacket is lighter than this one. This sleeve has got more highlights here than this side. This part is much darker because it's underneath the lapel of this jacket and he's tilted this way, so that side of him is farther away from the light source. All of that makes a huge difference. And if your realism isn't coming out the way you want, 9 times out of 10, that's why. Actually, I guess it is the top 2 things I always tell people. Make sure your lights are light enough and your darks are dark enough, and slow down. If it doesn't look the way you want, it's just because you're not done yet. And I'm debating whether to leave that for now. I probably should have started that sooner. Thinking about maybe trying to get to some of the wings so you guys could see it, because I've done enough back here that I can come back and fill that in now. And I may change my mind about some of the effect I put back in there now, but alright. For the heck of it, and so I can give my arm a little bit of a break. Here's my lid. Okay. While we have time left on the battery, I really wish I knew how much that was. I will start a little bit of the wings here. You're not going to get to see all of it, but I will get through some of it tonight. Oh! I should have put the other battery on the charger. Let's do that. You know, when I plugged it in the first time, I think it said like 6 hours, so I'm assuming I'm going to be filming for 6 hours. That didn't quite happen. I'm going to need to get to the bottom of that. Oh, crud. Oh, screw it, I'll charge it later. Alright. I'm going to have some darkness here, so let's start laying that in. I'm going to kind of define the shape for now. I know these parts are going to be kind of lighter, but I'm going, partially because it's a big area, I'm not going to necessarily fill in with pencil stroke right now. And so I can stay light enough that I can still see my initial guidelines to kind of help me later. There's a lot of this stuff I draw in there because it helps me to remember where I'm putting my shadow or shading transitions. And I can do it anyway, but sometimes it's just kind of a time saver for me to recall where that is, so I don't have to... Sometimes you end up spending time correcting a proportion mistake or something like that as you're going along, just because you've covered up what you were doing with material or medium. And again, anything I can do to save myself some time and kind of keep track of what I intended and where I was, I will do that every time. But because I want these a little bit more defined, and I know this is going to be dark, I'm going to intensify this line a little bit. And the shape of it is going to change as I go along, so it doesn't have to be real exact. But I don't want that to disappear a lot right now. And I don't recall who I was talking to about it, but on the comments on one of the Supernatural pages, I was talking about this pencil in particular. Let's see if the name reads, or... I just don't know how well you can see stuff when the camera back there, because the light kind of disappears back there. The light in my apartment is just dismal. It's horrible. Anyways, this is... Statler Mars Lumograph. They have regular Mars Lumograph pencils, which are nice, but these are Mars Lumograph Black in particular. They actually have charcoal content in all of them. They come from, I think there's HB, or as one of my favorite YouTubers says, HB. She has an English accent. It's adorable. I love that. HB. I believe this is a HB, all the way up to 8B. This is an 8B. But because they've got a charcoal content in it also, they're darker automatically than standard 2, 4, 6B, 8B plain pure graphite pencils. So you can get darker without having to put so much graphite down and try to build those layers, because eventually, with the nature of graphite is it really is kind of a silvery material that you're going to eventually run out of tooth on the paper. You're not going to be able to get any more on there and get it any darker because you just can't get any more of it piled up on itself. It just won't appear any darker no matter what. There are ways I get around that, and I'll have that in other tutorial sessions. But these are naturally darker because of the charcoal content put in there, so that these are a good thing to use if you know you're working on something that's got a lot of darks in it. And you might be able to get to the same effect with regular 8B, which is one of the darkest ones, pencil. But this is nice because you can put less of it on the page because it's darker already, and you don't get as much of that graphite shine. I'm not sure you're seeing a lot of it in the camera here because I adjusted for that with the lighting, because where there's heavier coverage, you look at it at a certain angle and the light hits off the graphite, so it's a real silvery, crazy, kind of negative effect looking thing. It's a pain to photograph graphite because of that graphite shine, which is what that's called. So these are a nice way to get less than that, because there's not as much shine because there's charcoal content in it, but because they're naturally darker, you also don't have to put so hard of a layer on there. So once I actually start laying out defining some of my movement and shape here, I actually will be using some of that because these are going to be very dark black wings in some of the areas. Some of it is going to be very light and translucent and brighter show through. But I'm going to use that for a lot of parts of that, so I don't have to load up so much graphite in this, whether in pencil or in powder. It's just, it'd take so much longer to do that. Screw that, man. And because those are a blended charcoal, blended with charcoal and graphite, that works okay. 9XXB is another pencil I have that is also very dark, but it's got a heavy amount of charcoal in it, and it's very tricky to use. That's kind of something I teach people to use when they're at a certain level or for a very specific effect. I don't really recommend people using that just unless you know what you're doing, because it's tricky. And the main part of that is that if you're going to try to use charcoal with, like, straight charcoal or even a blended one like that with graphite also in the same drawing, you can layer graphite over the top of a layer of charcoal, because it actually will cling to the rough of the paper. Charcoal will cling to the rough of the paper differently than graphite, because graphite is a very slick mineral. It's just got a slipperiness that charcoal doesn't have, because charcoal is just ash and cindered wood, basically. That's what most charcoal is made out of. They just set logs on fire and crush it up. That's what it is. So charcoal will cling in a way that graphite won't. So you can put, if you want something super dark and you're not using a different technique to get your darks blended out, and that's something I'll put in another tutorial later, you'll want to put charcoal down first and then use your graphite on top for whatever reason that you're doing it, for your detail or whatever. On top of that, you really don't want to do it the other way around, because charcoal is very stiff and pumicey, like powdery material. It doesn't have a slip to it like graphite does, that when you try to take charcoal over the top of graphite later, especially if you've got a heavy coverage to the point where you can see that slick shine to it because there's a lot of it on there, the charcoal is just going to keep skipping off the surface of that. It's not going to adhere very well. It's going to be very streaky and look odd and horrible, and it's going to be hard to work with and hard to correct. So if you're going to use both for any reason in the same area, always put charcoal down first. Never do it the other way around, unless it's a particular technique you have and you want to do it that way, and the effect you get with it is what you want, and whatever. Like I said earlier, the rules are there ain't no rules. Do it the way you want, for the most part. Let's see here. Oh, no. Other way. There we go. I should have left it. So now my toolbox is in the way. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay, most of my darker ones are going to be back here. Okay, yeah, I'll just stay here. And one of the reasons I'm going back and kind of redefining some of my guidelines in some of these cases is because you'll blend them out because of what you're doing. They don't just, because I already put that down there, they're not necessarily going to stay there because they were already there. It's the same, it's put on in a different way with a pencil point, but it's the same graphite as the rest of this stuff, so these will just disappear and blend off too when I go over it. So they're, oh, well that's alright, I actually wanted that. So some of these, I still want to be able to maintain the shape of distinct feathers later, and I want to be able to see them when I start going back in and changing the light sources and defining the way the light is passing through it and some of the feather shapes and whatnot. So every time I blend one out more than I want it to be, I just go back and draw a guide back in. And a darker pencil is better to do that with because this has got a little bit of charcoal in it naturally, and it's the darkest one, it's the 8B. It's not necessarily gonna blend off as quick, and it's gonna show better, so I'll be able to see it better later. And we have a very long way to go in building these guys up, so whatever I post tomorrow, I guarantee you won't be done, but you'll see more done than you did today. And my arm hurts, so I gotta switch. But I don't want to do it left-handed, so actually I'll just go to some of these lower ones. So I don't have to lift my arm as high. And I did start with a promo photo of him as a reference to work off of for that, but these wings I added myself, they weren't in that. So I have my laptop next to me, it's off camera, you wouldn't see it, and that's where I keep my reference photos to look at. I don't really print them, as you lose clarity with it once you, because it's only as good as whatever printer you're using. I don't like that. I like to be able to see as high definition as possible, and I like better the way that, you know, light passes through, or the backlight of computers will highlight and define all those details better than the light trying to pass through paper and whatever quality you got because of the printer that you put it on. So if I'm ever working off of reference photos, and especially with like commissions because I'm drawing somebody's kid and they give me the photo they want me to use or whatever, I keep it off to the side and look at it for that for reference. Now, even though I added these myself, I kind of painted out in Photoshop a kind of digital plan for how I want these to look, just to give myself a frame of reference and to remind myself, and not really for something to look at so I know what to paint where, but so I remember what effect I wanted to do, so I'm not just painting at random, because that'll save me some time too. You can just free draw and do whatever you want and come up with all sorts of crazy stuff, or sometimes it's better to actually have a game plan before you start drawing. You save yourself some time and you're more deliberate about it. And so I've got this thing up on my laptop screen over on my right here to remind myself, okay, here's how you want these to look when they're done. Don't go heavy over there, or blah, blah, blah. And it really is random why I'm painting areas I am right now. There's really no particular logic to it. It's just me. That's one thing that every artist has. Why we do it, the way we do it, and the order we do it, and why we're touching this all of a sudden when we were over here. Sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes it really just is not at all. And in my case, mostly right now, it's because I'm trying to keep my arms rested. Because I'm having to hold them higher than usual. Make sure my head is not in the way. Good. And when I mentioned earlier that you're constantly checking your values, you do that as you go along. I mean, an area that you could have thought you finished or considered finished, as you fill in other areas, how it appears is going to change to your eye too, depending on what values are next to them. It's an optic thing. All of art is, and light is. That's what it is. It's optics. So you may discover later that, okay, you know what, that's not really dark enough because I want this to be this dark, so I need to intensify this, or this needs to be lighter, or whatever. So I may be constantly correcting those as I go along. And that's true in this case, that I know how dark I want these to be and how dark this is going to be eventually. And I don't want him to look too stark. So where all the deeper shadows hit, like around, especially around this side, I'm probably going to deepen that up a little bit, but I'm not going to do it right now because I want it to match the value range when what's up against it is done, and I'm not anywhere close to getting that the way I want it yet. But this will probably change a little bit, which is the reason I didn't give him a tan trench coat. It was just going to be too stark. I didn't want him to look like he was popping that far off the page. I wanted a little bit of spooky atmosphere and whatnot. And that just would have looked too bright and odd. If I was doing this in color, yeah, I probably would have made it tan, because all bets are off. When you switch to color, it's a different way of seeing it, and your eye will make sense out of color changes in a way that it doesn't like as much when you're looking in one monochrome, one tone, grayscale, whatever you want to call it. Artists know what I mean, don't you? Where my artist at? I'm going to leave that halo for now. Tell you what, y'all, this is the most graphite powder I've ever used in one sitting, or one piece, before. This is kind of cracking me up, because I've been saying for ages that I never go through very much of it. And still, there's still a ton of it in here. I mean, it's hard to see, but I mean, there we go, almost none of it in there. There's like hardly even making a dent how much I have in this. The jar is this big and this big around. Seriously, unless I start doing like giant scale pieces that are super black, it's going to take me so long to go through all of that, and I still don't even know if that would do it. These are because I still got it out. I know these down here are ones that I'm going to have be fairly translucent. I'm going to lay some stuff down here before I set it aside for a second. But because I know that I'm at much more depth that I want to put in these, while you can cover a lot of area quickly with graphite powder, and there are some things that it makes, like this with no discernible pattern, that it makes more sense to do it with powder. These are actually going to be so very, very dark that it would take a long time and a lot of dust fall, because I'd have to have too much on my brush to get the depth that I'd want. It's actually going to be harder and take longer to do that with powder. So I'm going to lay out some of these ones that are going to be relatively translucent, just because I'm using up what's left on my brush right now because I've already got it out. I'm not even going to do all of them. I'll come back to that. Okay, push away from now. Okay, in this case, and maybe I'll do, well, okay, I think I'm going to move to the left-hand side for a minute to give my, oops, arm a little bit of a break, but that means I'm going to have to cross over this, and I don't want to touch it, and because I know I'm going to want to lean because my arm really is kind of bugging me. So I'm going to lay that up there so I'm not laying all over Cass's face. And I'm actually going to use this to start putting in some intense blacks in. You know, and I think I'm probably going to make that a highlight later, but I am still going to be using brushes with these. You know what? I changed my mind on what I want that to be. I'll put that back in as a guide because it's probably going to be lighter later. I'll take it back up later. So most of my deep tones are going to be right about here, so I'll start defining some of these. Once again, make sure my head is not in the way. Now there's too much pattern show through from the paper here that I don't like. Now you can, the more layers you put up, the more that'll get covered. I hate pattern show through, which is why when I want stuff super smooth, I use Bristol because it's got very little pattern in it. I'm just making one. But even when I'm laying down pencil that's just to cover area, I'm still using a brush to blend that out because that's actually going to start forcing some of that down into the tooth, so it's half the work. And I just keep going until I've got enough of the deepness or lightness that I want, and as much as the pattern of the paper tooth I want is gone. This is one of those filbert shaped ones. It doesn't leave harsh edges like a flat would. I'd constantly be correcting against that weird pattern left over from that if I did it that way. I don't like that. What's Mr. Cameron doing? Still with us? Wow, okay. I hear a kitty down there. No, I'm hallucinating. Oh, there he is. Thank you. Shoot, I shouldn't have said anything to him. Now he's going to come over and be loud and annoying. Nope, I was right the first time. I said earlier that the way you hold one of your tools, or media or whatever, makes a difference. Sometimes I'm holding it more like this to get more of the point for definition, but when I'm filling areas I'm holding it more like this because it's skipping off the tooth a little bit better and it's not grinding. So if I was doing it this way so much, I'd be grinding into the tooth more, which means I'd be flattening the tooth out a lot more and a lot quicker. And at this stage, you know, once you get towards the ends of an area and like finishing up the effect that you're having there, it doesn't matter because you're not going to be disrupting it again. But while you're still working on your initial layers and stuff, you don't want to flatten the tooth out if you can help it, you know, as little as possible, because it's harder to get it off, back off with an eraser. It's harder to layer on top other things on top of it, all sorts of stuff that makes it more difficult. And you may ruin it in one go and then not be able to get any more intense with it because it's just not going to cling to itself anymore. So you can still get plenty on there just by continually going over it, like so. But I'm not beating up the paper surface doing that either. And that's why I use these a lot too, because that blends it down in there without grinding the paper. It's just very delicately pushing it into that tooth pattern. I can see it because of the way the light's hitting it here, but there's a... It's not a wax bloom like you get with colored pencils, but it's kind of the same thing. It's a stickiness effect that you get once it builds up to a certain layer, and that's what makes it difficult because it coats the paper in a way that's difficult to get off of, but also a sticky and slip effect that nothing else will adhere to. I'm stopping there because I know part of the effect I'm going to have around this area is those are going to kind of, the light's going to pass through them different, because the light's going to pass through all these differently anyway, just because of the angle they're going at and whatnot, but because these are successive layers, there's still going to be highlights in this area and in some of the tips of these, and some of that just is going to be left there to define the shapes and the look of them. But generally, more light's going to pass through these because there's one layer, and it's going to be darker and darker and darker because you're going to have more layers of stuff, you know, just like one piece of fabric, another piece of fabric, another piece of fabric or paper, whatever the heck it is you're talking about. Less light's going to pass through, so it's going to be naturally darker. So I'm not going to put as much down here because I know I'm going to be fading that off a lot more later. Now, it could turn out that quite a bit of it ends up getting put back in anyway, but as I said, it's better to do that later than have to take it up again. And this is bothering me a little because of that stickiness it gets, but it would just be a nightmare to do it with an 8B. Straight graphite 8B anyway. And charcoal black is so much more of a deeper and a weird kind of, it can be bluish, but there's more of a earthy brownish tone to the black than graphite, which tends to be a very blue black. So I tend not to mix the two in the same drawing. I mean, sometimes I want that effect, but I don't a lot if I can help it, because the tones will look too different from each other and it's jarring. Sometimes that looks cool, but that's not what I want here. In this case, since this is blended with graphite, that's kind of already built in, so I'm not worried about it. And there's going to be a shadow fall. This is going to get darker as I go along, but there's going to be more over here because there's going to be more of a shadow fall because this one is laying on top of this one, on top of this one, on top of this one. But that's going to be affected by where I decide to have the light pass through them too. I just know that I'm not going to put any there. And sometimes I don't even know. I'm like, oh, okay, well, all right, well, if I ended up putting that one there and I don't want to take it back off, well then I better make this one have light pass on this side and whatnot. I think, other than the tips, these are going to be fairly dark up here. Dang it. Oh, my arm hurts. See what I go through for you guys. Well, what I'm going through for my mother, I guess. Another reason she doesn't get any more for a long time. Quarter to 11. Ah, stupid time wasted camera. All right. Well, actually, since I think you guys have seen enough of what I intended to get through with this for now, I'm actually gonna. And because this is an awfully long tutorial, I'm going to cut you guys off now so I can just kind of focus on and power through a bit of this. I think I'm only going to work for another couple of hours because I don't want to accidentally stay up till God knows when again. So, we're done for now. I'll have more tutorials in the future. Hope you guys learned some stuff. Ask me questions anytime you want. Whatever I get done tonight, I will post tomorrow for all of those that you were excited to see it. Thank you again for your interest and support and all the very nice things that you all constantly say. I really wish I could sell you fan art portraits. I'm sorry I can't. Maybe if I get famous enough, I can become like the official portrait artist for a bunch of the studios and then I'll be allowed to. Who knows? See if I can pull that one off. Anyways, thank you very much. Bye, guys.